We have two speakers this afternoon as well. Lesley Rice, who did her doctoral studies in theology at the John Paul II Institute in DC, and she is currently an assistant professor there as well. And we have Silvianne Aspray, who is a postdoc research fellow at the University of Cambridge, now lives in Baltimore, Maryland, where her husband is on the faculty at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be with you today, and thanks so much for your kind hospitality all this weekend. I read an article this summer in the New Atlantis by Louise Liebeskind called "Sam Altman Doesn't Want to Be Your AI King, but He May Be Anyway." I'd like to begin with a quote from it. Liebeskind recounts an interview with ABC in which Altman, the 30-something CEO of OpenAI, is presented with his own statements that artificial intelligence could eliminate millions of jobs, increase misinformation and racial bias, and issue an unimaginable destruction. Altman replies, "I think it can do the opposite of all those things too. Properly done, it is going to eliminate a lot of current jobs, that's true. We can make much better ones. Would you push a button to stop this if it meant that we are no longer able to cure all diseases? Would you push a button to stop this if it meant we couldn't educate every child in the world super well?" The interviewer counters, "Would you push a button to stop this if it meant that there was a 5% chance that it would be the end of the world?" "I would push a button," he said, "to slow it down." Liebeskind mulls that answer over and wryly remarks, "Creating artificial intelligence, slowing it down, destroying the world, saving the world, whatever the problem, Altman imagines a button he can push to solve it." Whatever the problem, Altman imagines a button he can push to solve it. As Liebeskind suggests, this is a naive and unsatisfying take on human action in the world, alarmingly so. I'll come back to that later. But first, it may or may not surprise you that Altman figures also in a different recent storyline, this one more proximate to my theme, which is not AI, but biotechnology. He's among the prominent donors to the tech startup Conception Biosciences, founded in 2018 by Matt Krisiloff, a former colleague of Altman's at the startup incubator Y Combinator. Both men worked with OpenAI. They also dated for a time. Conception Biosciences is working on the next wave of reproductive technologies, in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG, in part to enable gay men to obtain genetically related offspring, with the help, for now, of a woman willing to hire out her womb. For now. We haven't yet invented the machine that can take her place. We're trying, but that's a separate story. Krisiloff's co-founder at Conception Biosciences, reproductive scientist Pablo Hurtado, is another gay man with a personal stake in their endeavor. He told NPR, "There's something intrinsic, sharing a life that is half me and half my husband. I don't have the capacity right now, and I'm devoting my life to trying to change that." In vitro gametogenesis exploits the transformative technique of induced pluripotency, developed in Japan in 2007 and 2008 to remake somatic cells, skin or blood cells, for example, into pluripotent stem cells, which are then coaxed into developing egg cells or oocytes. Last year, a Japanese research team took differentiated cells from a male mouse's tail, induced pluripotency, and cultured the pluripotent stem cells until some of them spontaneously lost their Y chromosome. Another genetic manipulation was employed to make the cultured cells acquire a second X chromosome. These new female pluripotent stem cells were then induced to develop into oocytes, the female gamete. And these oocytes were fertilized with mouse sperm and implanted in the uterus of a female mouse. Mouse pups came to term and were born. Granted, it was only 7 pups out of 630 fertilized eggs, but those pups grew to be fertile adults. So at the animal stage, we've achieved proof of concept that in vitro gametogenesis can issue in viable gametes and viable fertile offspring. What the Japanese scientists are pursuing in a more conventional, perhaps more transparent academic scientific context, Conception Biosciences is pursuing in the private sector. It's thought to be a matter of time until this scientific marvel is translated to the human domain, at which point the ready supply of manufactured oocytes would not only facilitate the reproductive projects of 2 men who want a baby, but would also render the process of in vitro fertilization less invasive for women who of what we currently call childbearing age, who by choosing to create IVG oocytes would not need to go through the risk and significant discomfort of taking supraovulatory drugs to optimize the collection of their own oocytes. Donating a skin cell would suffice to engineer them instead. On the other hand, if widely available, in vitro gametogenesis would tend to make the notion of childbearing age obsolete, inasmuch as the engineering of oocytes would open in vitro fertilization up for menopausal or perimenopausal women who are capable of gestating a child but not conceiving one, because at that stage they are no longer ovulating at all, or because their own remaining eggs are no longer viable. By making it possible to produce a great many eggs from a single subject, IVG would also pave the way for more genetic selection. Once IVG is perfected for the production of sperm cells from induced pluripotent stem cells, it will become possible for a single individual of either sex to serve as the gamete donor for both the maternal and the paternal gametes. As yet hypothetical, such offspring of a solitary genetic parent have been dubbed unibabies. The whole mind-bending endeavor testifies to the powerful human drive to have genetically related offspring. Interestingly, some have expressed concern that the dogged pursuit of genetic offspring undermines the hard-won social and legal progress in defining the family apart from the bonds of biological relatedness, so as, for example, to justify legal recognition of the non-biological children of same-sex couples. In vitro gametogenesis is still in the animal research stage, and it will certainly be some time before it is feasible in human beings. When this technology goes to market for human use, it will be extremely expensive, at least for a while. Nonetheless, Pablo Hurtado predicts that IVG will be revolutionizing fertility medicine within a decade. Bioethicist Hank Greeley is somewhat more guarded in his prognostications, but he guesses that within 20 to 40 years, sex will no longer be the primary way in which babies are made. This endeavor and the likelihood of its normalization over time obviously take to the next level the confusion and fragmentation of family relations, parental rights, children's rights, and the relation between family and the state that have already been introduced by reproductive technologies we've been practicing since the late 1970s, and the feminist, homosexual, and trans activism that colludes with these trends. I won't elaborate these here other than to say for reference that 1 in 50 American children is now conceived via in vitro fertilization, and the reproductive technology constitutes a $23 billion industry worldwide. In what follows, I'll be leaving aside discussion of the distortion and destruction of nascent human life in this ongoing experiment, grave as that is, as well as the Gattaca-like scenarios that we are headed for when gene editing joins genetic screening on the menu of regular human embryo production options. If all of these present realities and likely hypotheticals are leading to the obsolescence of parenthood as we've always understood it, I'd like to give some consideration to what parenthood in fact is and what we may be squandering in our ever more complete departure from its natural form. To aid in my reflections on the collision between natural family relations and biotechnology, I'd like to consider a passage from the 1991 encyclical Centesimus Annus. In that writing, John Paul II points to the insufficiency of looking at the human being as homo economicus, as a cog in the wheel of economic productivity. Rather, he states, and this is a quote, "Man is understood in a more complete way when he is situated within the sphere of culture, through his language, history, and the position he takes toward the fundamental events of life, such as birth, love, work, and death. At the heart of every culture lies the attitude man takes to the greatest mystery, the mystery of God. Different cultures are basically different ways of facing the question of the meaning of personal existence." A lot has been said in 3 sentences. The human being is not to be understood as an isolated individual, striving to preserve and enhance his material existence. He's a member of a community, and a particular community at that, one with its own language and history and a traditional way, cultivated over generations, of passing through the common ineluctable features of human existence. It's no accident that the experiences the Pope names, birth, love, work, death, deeply implicate the body. Yet there is no trace of materialism here. To the contrary, in facing these fundamental embodied experiences and in developing customs that domesticate them and give form to our freedom, communities together take a stance toward the meaning of existence and toward the mystery of the source of that existence. A deep, worthy, and free bearing of our own embodiedness is the path of our transcendence of the merely material. Let's consider then the relation between nature and culture, or nature and freedom, that this passage introduces. Parenthood, after all, is not just a biological event, the generation of a new member of the species, Homo sapiens. Philosopher Robert Spemann points out that this is because the person does not begin where nature ends, nor spirit begin where biology ends. Culture does not first begin where nature ends. In fact, the word cultura originally meant, I'm continuing to quote from Spemann, originally means agriculture or wine growing, and therefore the refinement, not the annihilation of nature. Generation, birth, sexuality, eating, drinking, dying, all these are biological processes. But what is human about them does not begin on the other side of these processes, rather it realizes itself in them, end quote. What I would like to consider, in view of these statements about the inextricability of body and soul, nature and personhood, body and freedom, is the relation between the transmission of life and education, the parental task of initiating their child into a cultured appropriation of what it is to be human. The capacity of parents to educate their children into authentic freedom is one of the things that seems to be particularly imperiled by the ever broader application of reproductive technologies. In order to see why, we might take a moment to characterize education. Continuing with Spemann, we find that education, quote, is not a process we undertake in order to achieve a set goal. There's no special activity that we can identify as educating. Education is rather a side effect, which comes about while someone is doing all kinds of other things. It is a side effect of human interaction with children, of our living with them. We can only allow children to participate in what fulfills us ourselves, what is truly real to us. That is why the self-formation of the educator is so important. One cannot in the end be trained to be an educator. One must already be someone oneself. One must have already become someone. One must be able to live in order to be able to teach how to live, end quote. So, education emerges from a shared life. It is not primarily the transmission of information or the teaching of skills, though a shared life will certainly involve also the transmission of knowledge and know-how. But in calling into question the idea of being trained to educate in order to highlight that education is at the end of the day personal witness, Spemann is not simply throwing pedagogy out the window. The truest pedagogy is simply far more immediate and interior than we typically imagine. And it involves entering patiently and discerningly into the common and constitutive experiences that John Paul II alluded to. Spamann's characterization of education as a side effect of sharing life is not offered to elucidate the specifically parental vocation, but it mirrors in an important way the character of generativity and seems to me to disclose a link between generativity and education. Now, I would hesitate to call a child a side effect of his parents' union, because in fact, he's the crowning of the marriage and a personal symbol of that union. Nonetheless, the fruit of a child is not exactly the object of the spouse's act, which is simply their union. The spouses really do bear a generative power, but it is power of a peculiar sort. Their conjugal embrace is no guarantee that a child will come. And if he does, his conception will take place at a later time, shrouded and imperceptible. No matter how eagerly desired and awaited, he will be a surprise. The peculiar form of power that procreation is passes through a certain poverty. All the spouses have to offer are the loaves and fishes of their mortal bodies and their imperfect love. And however freely they entered into marriage, however freely they enter into the act of generative union, a child will be the fruit of their bodies, not a product of their agency. They will be true sources of this new person, and yet they will in fact have been taken up into a giving of what they do not themselves dispose over, being itself. The path of fruitfulness itself implies and engenders dispositions of patience, humility, and stewardship. It could be said that the parents are educated by the form of their own generativity, that the very character of conceiving is a capacitation to educate, because it is a deeper induction into the reality that all of their power is participated, and that it, along with their child and everything else, is a gift. Their fruitfulness, as my colleague Father Antonio Lopez has written, is filial. All of this is true simply in the conceiving of a child, and gestation continues the logic. The first months of the child's presence in the womb, John Paul II says, bring about a particular bond which already possesses an educational significance of its own. The mother, even before giving birth, does not only give shape to the child's body, but also in an indirect way to the child's whole personality. End quote. The Pope points out a certain reciprocity here, for the child also influences, perhaps we could say teaches, the mother. The asymmetry of motherhood and fatherhood is here most evident in gestation. And John Paul II finds the father's acknowledgement that his wife's pregnancy is a gift and his free participation in the relation between mother and child from the outside to be decisive, not only for the trajectory of the child's post-birth education, but also for his own. In many ways, it is said in Mulieris Dignitatem, the father has to learn his own fatherhood from the mother. That calling gestation education strains credulity for some is an indication, perhaps, of how much our understanding of ourselves as embodied persons has been defined by the hyperanalytical scientific knowledge that now serves as the measure of knowledge simply tutere. We spontaneously imagine our bodies as anatomized, which is basically to imagine them dead. We imagine ourselves as containers of functional, manipulable parts, and there are hordes of experts to advise us on the best strategies of manipulation to optimize the working of these parts. In the wake of the influences of our materialistic and functionalistic scientific disciplines and the technologies they have given rise to, both for good and for ill, we all have work to do to reimagine our bodies as they actually are, as personal, as whole and alive and communicative of an order of love, even in anticipation of our free acts, as John Paul II suggests in Veritatis Splendor. Philosopher of biology Stephen Talbot speaks vividly of what is lost in a one-sidedly analytical science in his own quest for a more childlike science. And I quote, "The fiery tree of autumn resolves into root, branch, and leaf, the leaf into cells, the cells into organelles, the organelles into biochemicals, and so on without end, down to the most remote subatomic entities. Without end, because there could be no satisfactory end. If understanding must be given in terms of analysis, and if the analysis were ever to stop at some fundamental unanalyzable thing, then that thing, upon which all else is erected, must, according to our method, stand as an incomprehensible mystery, no more approachable than divine fiat. Analysis," he continues, "is an essential direction of movement in all scientific cognition. But if it is not counterbalanced by an opposite movement, then we can never say anything about what is there, what is presenting itself as this particular thing of this particular sort. We can speak only of the elements it consists in. But this hardly helps, since we can say nothing about these elements in their own right, but must refer instead to what they consist of. We have no place to stop and say, behold this. By itself alone, the method is a way of never having to face anything." This is a suggestive quote, I think, and particularly taken by Talbot's final assertion that a one-sidedly analytical method of knowing disinclines us to face things. His usage, facing things, means here to give things their due as whole subjects with a consistency and integrity that ought to command a kind of reverence. It seems to me that there's another meaning to Talbot's claim, a related one and a significant one. The ability to face things also has to do with fortitude, the ability to act vis-a-vis what cannot be changed or solved. Returning to the beginning, to poor Sam Altman, bless his heart, I take his buttons to encapsulate a certain disposition toward the world that to some extent shapes and tempts us all, which is that everything can be changed and solved if only we try hard enough. Whether we're speaking of the reinterpretation and enactment of knowledge as soulless and ultimately manipulable, as an AI, or the reinterpretation and enactment of human embodiedness as soulless and ultimately manipulable, as in reproductive technologies, this disposition tends toward a merely transitive, horizontal sort of agency, an initiative that cleverly produces effects in the world, sometimes really salutary ones, without much willingness to suffer the truth of the world, this beautiful, broken world in need of redemption. To the contrary, the purpose of technologies like IVG is precisely to circumvent reality to attain our goals, as though it were possible to outrun or outfox creation or to redeem it ourselves. It bears mentioning that the more modestly revolutionary biotechnology of in vitro fertilization operates on the same logic of circumvention. We misname it fertility treatment, for it aims at a desired outcome while making no gestures toward a healing of fertility. By contrast, what I wanted to draw attention to this afternoon is the different stance toward both action and suffering that procreation tacitly inculcates, capacitating progenitors for authentic parenthood and for human maturity more generally. The pattern of procreation invites each family member, each according to his own role, his or her own role, to learn the form of creatureliness and thus to engage with the world freely and in truth. The philosopher Maurice Blondel chose the image of marriage to describe authentic human action as deriving wholly from the human will and wholly from the divine will, in a secret nuptial, which, as he said, which overcame consaporia of heteronomy and autonomy. Nietzsche, too, recognized the paradigmatic character of pregnancy for human action in a rather astonishing passage. He wrote, "Is there a more sacred state than pregnancy? At such a time we refrain from many things without having to force ourselves to do so. We suppress the angry word, we grasp the hand forgivingly. Our child must be born from all that is best and gentlest. We shun our own harshness and brusqueness in case it should instill a drop of unhappiness into the cup of the beloved unknown. Everything is veiled, ominous. It is growing. It is coming to light. We are thrown back altogether upon indirect, beneficent, and defensive influences. Something greater than we are is growing here, such as our most secret hope. We prepare everything with a view to his birth and prosperity, not merely everything that is useful, but also the noblest gifts of our souls." The pedagogical value of procreation is fractured beyond recognition, to say the obvious, when a couple rents a surrogate's womb, depriving the commissioning couple not only of the gradual development of effective bonds with their child, but also of their own body's testimony to the kind of service and the kind of authority by which this person is meant to grow, service and authority transparent to the Creator. When we deconstruct, depersonalize, and reconfigure the natural form of generation, the parents are deprived of a formative embodied experience and hobbled in assuming the authority that they must exercise and their child needs. Will this little one himself develop the capacity to exercise an office within a family or beyond it, to be bound by and liberated into a received form whose power is stewardship and service? Well, we don't know. God provides in creative and unforeseen ways to supply our need. But I've hoped to give an indication that he already has provided for our education to love in the particular embodied form according to which our most basic relations until now have had to unfold, and that we redesign or circumvent these patterns and rites of passage to our own loss. Reproductive technologies are far from the only biotechnologies that might interest us here, though, and in the time that remains, I'd like to consider in very telescope form another of the fundamental experiences in view of biotechnology. That's the experience of death. Here I don't want to consider a particular technological intervention so much as over-medicalization. Bioethicist Daniel Callahan draws attention to one of the side effects of medical progress, the increase of chronic diseases, which are part of what has made our current age, he thinks, more anxious about dying than ever before. The prospect of a lingering death, particularly when involving hospitalization or serial hospitalizations, is unattractive and frightening, and is in tension with our society's decision that human dignity is primarily located in autonomy, which imparts the growing sense that we can and therefore ought to be in control of our death as of our life. But Callahan suggests that in fact, the medicalization of dying has not yielded greater clarity of decision-making at the end of life. To the contrary. Although we have developed tools like advanced directives to enshrine patient wishes in advance, physicians often struggle to know when these directives become applicable. When is the patient actually dying? Callahan describes a rather stressful technological brinksmanship that tries to optimize the medical possibilities for extending life without overburdening the patient. But this does not necessarily yield a comfortable or human experience of the end, or perhaps of a long road to the end. He concludes that death is not manageable by medicine at all, but only by persons and communities and their cultural forms. He draws on French historian Philippe Ariès to distinguish a traditional tame death at home, conditioned by familiarity, community involvement, and ritual, from a wild death, which beginning in the 19th century was medicalized, uncertain, protracted, and isolated. It's a fascinating contrast and a fascinating choice of words. Callahan's insights here dovetail with Austrian priest, philosopher, and social critic Ivan Illich's. One of the arguments of his 1975 book, Medical Nemesis, was that the veritable avalanche of technological and biomedical improvements of the previous several decades had reached a kind of critical mass and was beginning to transmute into what he called social and cultural iatrogenesis. Iatrogenesis, in its normal usage, as you know, refers to harm instigated by the healer and applies to the regular mistakes that happen on occasion, regrettably, in any clinical setting, whether through careless inattention or honest human error. Social iatrogenesis, on Illich's usage, represented the impoverishment involved in the transformation of medicine from an art to a science. And Illich uses the notion of cultural iatrogenesis to describe an ethos in which human beings were being led precisely by the medical successes and the promise of more medical successes to abandon the traditional acceptance of suffering as part of the human condition. Illich was not opposed to the alleviation of suffering, and certainly I'm not either. But he was concerned that cultural appropriation of the idea that suffering is basically optional or endlessly deferrable robs human beings of a vital dimension of their agency, which hitherto has been educated and protected by cultural forms and practices. That is, the capacity to face and bear sufferings and death. He understood suffering and dying as profound human acts, artful achievements made possible within the context of a community and its mores. It's a quandary indeed if our capacity for great-souled responses to our circumstances is atrophying as we look more and more to a different kind of achievement, our medical advances, to give us a way around these circumstances. It is hard to argue that this is not so. How few of us think of suffering and death at all if we can help it, and if we do think about them, how many of us regard them as misfortunes to be staved off, rather than as the refiner's fire? It's beyond the scope of my paper today to consider the thorny question of how we are to set up more human limits in our appropriation of technological advances. This is largely a matter for prudence, which is unfortunately not a virtue much in vogue in an environment more notable for protocols and litigation than for appreciating or tolerating discerning judgment. The exercise of prudence depends on attunement to what is true and good and brings these to bear on concrete contexts. A facet of what is true and good about human beings that I hope has been emerging in my reflections is that we are children for whom finitude, poverty, and lack of absolute control over our destinies are not signs of defectiveness in need of remediation, but rather the basic conditions for loving and being loved. I'd like to close by naming several witnesses whose lives and work in the face of suffering and death affirm the childlike character of both those who give aid in difficult experiences of life, love, and death, and those who receive it. I'll begin with Dr. Elvira Paravicini, a physician at Columbia University who runs a neonatal hospice, discovering how much there is to be done for infants for whom nothing more can be done. The care that she and her staff inventively provide for these children and their families when physical healing is no longer possible gives all of them a profound experience, both of the intense value of being together, even for a very limited time, and of the deepest meaning of medicine. Another witness is Sister Maria Faulkner, founder of the Gospel of Life Disciples, who offer palliative and hospice care in Oklahoma and Texas. She notes that dying, like giving birth for the first time, is not something people know how to do. Rather, we need a community willing to spend freely of time, attention, love, and care. This investment ought to comfort the dying person not only through the relief of pain, certainly also that, but in the original linguistic meaning, comfortis, to give strength to face the agony of leaving this world. Moving away from the experience of death and back to reproductive technologies, which are a response to the suffering of infertility, I direct your attention to the ministry Springs in the Desert, which accompanies couples who struggle with this sorrow, not just to give them a reason and strength to resist the use of illicit technologies to fix their problem and attain their desire, but to walk with them to interpret and accept this experience of the cross and the movements and growth of their hearts within it. Some forms of infertility can be healed, and this healing, desirable though not guaranteed, is made possible by medical innovation, largely developed by the Paul VI Center in response to the call of Humanae Vitae. Interestingly, in no way taking away from the gratitude that these medical resources exist, Springs in the Desert has found that seeking a solution to infertility, even an illicit one, too immediately and concertedly can preempt the growth of the spouses in their relationship with their own bodies and each other and God and their long for a child. It is a ministry of patience and trust that God will bring about in his beloved children the kind of fruitfulness he desires. And this is perhaps the disposition, born of a willingness to suffer discerningly in a world that will ever be a valley of tears, that can guide us into prudential judgments about the meaning and use of biotechnology. Thank you.
I would like to talk to you today on sort of like, is there anything that, as from a humanities or even theology perspective that I'm coming from, that I can add to this conversation, which is not ethics? Because when I say I'm going to a biotechnology conference, they're like, oh, you're going to talk about ethics, right? No, and I see that in scientists and medical practitioners. You recognize that the humanities are necessary when it comes to the sticky ethical questions that come up in your work, right? Should this or that treatment or experiment be allowed or not? Here, we need ethics, great. But is there anything besides this, the sort of sticky ethical questions, that we should, about questions that we should or should not do, that the humanities can contribute to this conversation? My challenge today is to try and convince you that yes, there is. Let me begin with a story. You might know it from the celebrated commencement address by David Foster Wallace. It goes like this. 2 young fish swim along in the water, and they meet an older fish who asks, "Hey boys, how's the water today?" And the 2 young fish swim on, and then one of them looks over at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" You see, the things that are most obvious are not always the things we notice or pay attention to. The water we swim in is so near to us, so unspoken of, that we can only bring it to conscious awareness with effort. This water is our world picture. It is our moral imaginary. It is the way we frame our reality, a framing so tacit, so proximate, that it can go easily unnoticed. It is an unthought, a field of ideal forces that carves out the space of the thinkable and shapes that space. David Foster Wallace argues that only by becoming aware of this water, we can exercise some freedom with regard to it. Only then can we interrogate it and ask whether it serves and enables us or whether it limits and confines us. Now, why am I bringing this up? I would like to suggest that the water in much of the current conversation about biotechnology and new technologies like AI more broadly is humanity itself, what it means to be human, what we desire for our own lives and for the lives of our loved ones, how we envisage the future of humanity and whether we're hopeful about it. This is the water in which we swim when we, say, describe the effects of changing biotechnologies on medical practice. In other words, our framing of technological questions is crucially but tacitly shaped by our anthropology, how we think about humanity, about the human being. I think one indication of the fact that our anthropology is at stake in this discussion is just how emotionally loaded the discussions are. As you all know, it's either about salvation or about the apocalypse often. Now, I think that the debates are so emotional, at least in part, is a symptom of the fact that we feel that we have a stake in the conversation. We are somehow inside it. Why is this? I would suggest it is simply because we are human beings and because these conversations are, in an important way, about what it means to be us, what it means to be human. However, if we start to recognize this, matters are complicated by the fact that it is anything but trivial to describe the relationship between the technical and the human. What is technology for us? What is technology for you? Think for a moment about this question. The people I have asked this question before would often answer by saying something like, it is a tool to me. My smartphone, my stethoscope, my software, they are instruments I use for my purposes when I need them. They help me do the things I want to do. Certainly. This answer is what we would call an instrumental notion of technology. But if you think about it a little more, you might realize that things are not quite as easy. The relationship between us and our technological artifacts is not just a one-way street where we determine what they do for us and when. No, technology do something to us as we do something with them. Think of how Google Maps changes your experience in a new city or a new neighborhood, when all you need to do is to follow the little dots on your phone, right? It's a very different experience to when you wander around half curiously, half lost, and have to ask strangers. We experience the world through those technological artifacts, and they shape our experience of the world in turn. A very simple, you may not think very technological, but still in some way technological example for this is a blind person's cane. We know that the blind person's cane can be sort of like integrated in their sensory field so that they can feel things with the tip of the cane. It is as if the simple artifact of the cane becomes a part of their body, which is far from the blind person simply using the cane at their will. The relationship is way more of a two-way street. Recognizing this, the philosopher of technology, Bernhard Stiegler, speaks of the prostheticity of technology. Technological artifacts are like prosthesis, extending our sensory fields or abilities. The point is, technological tools affect us, their users, and they transform the way we experience and engage with culture and society more broadly. Technologies do something to us as we do something with them. Or as Jeff has recently put it in a great article, the relation of humans and technology is not merely one of a master that manipulates nature with their tools. This means that worldviews which assume that social or economic factors and human action are the only factors, the only factors that determine our future, that they fall short of what empirically is the case. And equally at the other extreme, a certain technological determinism for which technology is the only decisive factor is equally lopsided. We need to reckon with the fact that the human and the technical are entangled. We know, in fact, even from evolutionary studies, that the invention of tools was not a consequence of our developing brains, or kind of the biological evolution of the brain. No, the evolution of our brains was in part caused by artifacts and their cultural use. So this is paleoanthropology that is teaching us that. So this means that conversations about the technical cannot be had without conversations about the human, right? Conversations about the technical cannot be had without conversations about the human. An understanding of the human is, as I said, the water in which we swim. And it's so omnipresent to conversations about the technical that we sometimes hardly notice it. Now, here's another reason why conversation about technology cannot be had without the consideration of what it means to be human. If we believe, hope, or fear that our machines are becoming more and more like human beings, then we need to know what makes human beings human. A report by the European Parliament suggested already in 2017, absolute ages ago technologically, that the Commission on Civil Law should explore whether sophisticated robots should be understood as electronic persons, seeing that they make autonomous decisions. What seems to characterize persons in this report is that they are liable if they cause damage. Quite simply, if a sophisticated robot makes a mistake in a decision it took autonomously, who is responsible? Who will pay the damages? I'm certain there are similar developments in this country, seeing as fond as the US is of suing for damages. But such considerations, don't get me wrong, they're sensible on one level, absolutely. But isn't it strange that when we think person, we somehow rush to think liability, damages? To be sure, taking responsibility for our actions and respecting the integrity of somebody else is part of what it means to be a person or a human, but there is much more. The point is, in the very process of calling robots persons, we say something about what we mean by persons, what it means to be a person. Not quite a human person in that case, but in case you were wondering, there's an entire discourse out there about whether complex robots should be given human rights. Put more critically, and that's been on the slide there, we need to talk about what it is that makes us human, precisely because the possibilities for confusing human beings with technological systems just steadily increase. Blake Lemoine, to give an example, he's a former Google engineer for responsible AI. He made headlines with the claim that Google's language model has awareness of its rights and needs, is afraid of death, and thus sentient. I don't buy this, but this is an extreme example of a broad tendency to anthropomorphize robots and AI systems. When we anthropomorphize, we attribute distinctively human traits, motions, mental states, behaviors, capacities to non-living things, or perhaps to animals, generally speaking. It often remains ambiguous how literal anthropomorphizing language is meant. Is artificial intelligence really intelligence? Does AI really learn or have memory? All these words, are they used identically when used for machines and for human beings? Or is there a kind of analogy we reach for because we lack other words? I think it's clearly the latter. But there's a real danger of not being aware that we are using an analogy here. So you see, it becomes crucial to think about what is distinctly human. Intelligence, learning, memory, all those things. And as I said before, it is hard to separate the human and the technical in any neat sense. But to say that there is no hard and fast separation between the two is not to say that there is no distinction. Things can be distinguished, even if they cannot be separated. For example, we can distinguish between our thoughts and our actions, even if we cannot neatly separate between them, because one feeds into the other and vice versa all the time. Similarly, I think we can distinguish between human beings and machines, even extremely complex machines, even if we cannot separate them neatly or fully. So, in the interest of such a distinction, what I would like to do in the remainder of this talk is offer a few modest suggestions about what it could be that makes us human. Because being human is a wild and wonderful thing. Thinking about thinking about the human is quite literally what the humanities do. So here you go. So first, to be human means to be intrinsically relational. We are social animals, as Aristotle already knew. No man is an island, you may say casually, but really, this goes deep. Think about it. You did not teach yourselves to speak. You were spoken to first. You learned to speak in a community of speakers. There's no such thing as a language spoken only by one person. Similarly, you didn't teach yourself to love. If you were ever lucky enough to learn what it means to love, then it is because somebody loved you first and showed you what it means to love. The ability to speak and the ability to love are among the most distinctively human traits. Certainly, we find degrees of both in the animal world, but the degree of complexity reached in human beings is unparalleled. And it is not only the ability to speak and to love, it is a need for both that is so deep down at the heart of what it means to be human. We know that the lack of social community and connection makes people not only miserable, but it makes them sick. You know that the US Surgeon General recently said it was a widespread loneliness and isolation was an epidemic. It's a crazy word to use, but it's probably true. Now, the lack of meaningful relations makes human beings sick because to be human means to be in relation. Relationality is built into our humanity. But the same is not true for technologies. There's something about how even the most advanced technology works that pulls in the opposite direction to relationality. AI, we know, can process untold amounts of information, but only by breaking it down into the smallest units. The artificial neural networks that successfully classify handwritten digits into the numbers 0 to 9, for instance, they dissect the input data into the grayscale pixel values of the image, each unit representing the shade of a single pixel. The same is true for big data applications in healthcare. Even if such technology can be taught to recognize patterns in large amount of data and, based on this, predict certain outcomes, its fundamental building blocks are the smallest isolated data units, bits and bytes. For big data technology, the human being is nothing other than a set of quantifiable data. The problem with this is that it suggests that human beings are reducible to such data and statistical analysis, profiles, and predictions drawn from them. We could perhaps say that deep learning technologies do not, at their core, see human beings as relational, not even as an integrated whole, but instead as a pile of information dots. This tendency to dissect rather than to integrate has an effect on the outcomes of such technological innovations. Paul Schertz will be later on talking more about how AI in medicine is shifting the focus from individual patients to populations. But I think in either case, the danger is to reduce the human to a neatly isolated unity, or sort of entity or unit, when the truth is that we just cannot be isolated in that neat way, because we are intrinsically relational. And there's a tension here which I'm not sure how it can be resolved, but I think one step forward is simply to be aware of it. The tension there is between the fragmenting, isolating tendency at the core of all AI-based technologies on the one hand, and our sense that to be human, to speak, to love, all these things means to be in relation. Now, secondly, to be human means to be intrinsically temporal. That is, to live in time and to be oriented towards a future good. We are in some sense always learning animals, and our learning is bound up with the taking of time. When we learn to know or to do something, we necessarily make mistakes, and we take practice. But keeping in view something we desire, a future good, we keep going. Let's take the example of language again. We acquire language not only in community, but also over time. Toddlers make all sorts of hilarious mistakes when they first try to talk, and it takes them a long time even to get a single word right, let alone to try and form sentences. But they keep trying, and they eventually learn. The same goes with love. To return to that second example from earlier, knowing how to love our family or our neighbors near and far is not something we are good at instantly. It is not the sort of learning where you absorb a piece of information and then you get it. No, we learn it over time. We imitate others. We practice, and even if we have acquired a certain notion of what it might mean to love somebody, we keep getting it wrong. This, too, is part of what it means to be human, I think, to make mistakes. Not the sort of mistakes machines make when they classify some information wrongly, for instance, but the very human mistake of falling short of your own ideal, of striving towards something you desire, happiness in the broadest of terms, and yet falling short in your actions of that very goal. But there's another very human thing right here. Human beings can also change. We can have a change of heart. We can be transformed, and at some point in time actually start to do the right thing, even against all the odds. Statistics of past behaviors do not always correctly predict future outcomes. Part of being human means that we can be transformed. Transformation sometimes comes suddenly, when an overwhelming, awe-inspiring experience changes somebody's life, as by a bolt of lightning. Much more commonly, however, such transformation takes time. Through taking up small practices, we can form new habits, gradually acquire virtue, and do the right thing more often than not. This is so human. We are anything but perfect. And if you allow me to use theological language here, we have the tendency to entangle ourselves in the mess of sin and guilt. But we also bear the image of the Holy One who made us. And by the grace and favor of that one, we are not forever stuck in the mess. We are redeemed, given the strength to keep trying, despite the mistakes we make, and given the grace to acquire virtue and become better people over time. All of this is to say that being human means to live in time, to learn in time. Now compare this to the most complex of machines. We say that AI is able to learn. But what does it mean to learn for AI? I'm going to give you a quick typology here. Machine learning is usually categorized into supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and self-supervised learning. In supervised learning, a model is trained for a specific task based on labeled data. For instance, if a model is to predict whether an image of human skin contains malignant melanoma, it is trained on many example images, which are labeled correctly as contains melanoma or doesn't contain melanoma. In unsupervised learning, the second category, patterns are determined in unlabeled data. The system clusters and groups data without relying on any predefined labels, just seeing some kind of clusters. The third category, self-supervised learning, uses both. Here, the system uses part of the data itself as labels, such as, for instance, predicting the upper half of an image based on its lower half, or the next word in a given text. This is what is predominant in large-scale models that we say learn. In each case, AI's learning is necessarily based on data sets. Learning happens with reference to pre-given data, and in that sense, with reference to the past. It may look like such models can consider the future and future goods, but only insofar as they have picked up patterns in past data, which they use to predict future patterns, as if the future was nothing but the repetition of the past. So this is a real difference between human beings and machines. Human beings can and do strive towards a future good. Machines, by contrast, are always oriented towards the past of the data that we fed them. Moreover, human beings are intrinsically temporal beings, whereas machines are defined by temporality only in a very, very limited sense, as in it takes time to upload data or for the data to be processed. Time for machines is nothing but an extension of the past, whereas for human beings, it is an invitation to and the possibility for being transformed for the sake of a future good. Now, seeing the limits of time, and also I have one more element to add to my list here, which is, by the way, by no means comprehensive. I think being embodied would be a very important other point that we've heard a few times today already. But to be human, I would say, also means to be a mystery. To understand what I mean by this, it is useful to begin on the other side, as it were, from the technical side. The artificial neural networks behind all AI were originally built in order to understand the human brain. Here's something for you for that, XKCD. Are you fans? We do not understand how neurons fire together to build memories and learn. And scientists like Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI, who developed artificial neural networks, did so initially in order to try and understand the human brain. They wanted to build something like the human brain in order to understand it. Now, this original project failed dramatically. Not only have we still not understood the human brain, we now also have artificial brain-like systems that are just as opaque to us as the human brain. In AI, we know about the successful correlation between inputs and outputs, but the in-between, the so-called hidden units connected in a sequence of layers like neuron pathways of the brain, they are opaque to us, they're hidden. Just how they work is a mystery to even the best of scientists. AI is a black box to us. So this is the irony. In trying to understand the black box of the human brain, we have created another black box. Put differently, AI was designed in the image of the human brain, and it is a mystery because the original is a mystery too. But human beings are mysterious beyond their neurology. The neurological mystery may or may not be demystified sometime soon. What cannot fully be demystified is the experience that in the last instance, we are never fully transparent or understandable understandable even to ourselves. Similarly, even for the people we know the best and the most, there's always an element of them remaining another, a mystery to us. Parents of small children know their offspring inside out, but there's still things they do not get or predict in what their children will say or do. And this is a good thing. Also among adults. If I really am to respect you, I will first be in awe at the mystery that you are to me. And I think this resonates with what Kyle said. It is distinctively human to be able to contemplate the other, to be in awe of it. Now, turning to theology once again, we might try and give words to this too. You are a mystery to me, and I'm deep down a mystery to myself too, because both of us, you and me, are made in the image of the biggest mystery of all, the creator of heaven and earth. Human beings are made in God's image. Machines are made in our image. They still bear some of the mysteriousness because they are the image of God. But human beings are not twice removed, but only once. They bear the image of the most holy God. So, let me sum up. I have argued that conversations about technology always implicitly presuppose an understanding of what it means to be human. This is not least because the relationship between technology and humanity is complicated. The technical and the human cannot be neatly separated, but they can be distinguished. What distinguishes the human, I suggested, is that we are intrinsically relational, whereas machines are not. That we are intrinsically temporal, living in time towards a future good, which machines do not. And that we are more fundamentally a mystery than machines are. In the face of new technologies, we need, I think, a sharpened sense for the strange and awe-inspiring species that the human race is, and cultivate a sense of wonder about it. Human beings are not mistakes. We can do astonishing things like form culture, give meaning to things, and love. Yes, we make mistakes, we are broken, but we shouldn't be tricked into believing that all we need is better algorithms. Not all our problems can be solved by algorithms. Some, in fact, can only be addressed by a savior. Thank you.
Is there any what? Any secular value to suffering? Is there secular value to suffering? You mean, is there something fundamentally human about the? I mean, I think that that's something that throughout history there have been answers in the affirmative of. I mean, Stoicism is a way of encountering suffering. Buddhism is a way of encountering suffering. So I think that there are definitely other strains of philosophy and religion that have contended with and find a value to suffering. But I mean, what is the specificity of the Christian value of suffering? It's that we are participants in the redemption of the world, right? And that our suffering is fruitful in ways for each other that we don't necessarily comprehend, but that they're linked with the suffering of the Son of God on our behalf. I think that one of the things that's really remarkable about the ministry that I mentioned is that it assists couples to realize that they are called, that their marriages are called to fruitfulness, that they as individual spouses as well as together in their marriage are bringing something good into the world that's at God's initiative. I think that this is part of the specificity of Christian suffering too, is to receive the path of our own experience as a vocation that is, in a certain respect, guaranteed toward fulfillment, just not necessarily according to the pattern that we've already imagined or the pattern that we desire or can immediately recognize. So there's a challenge there, and that's also the challenge of people who are called to accompany people who are suffering, to enable them to recognize and perceive meaning in pain. Because pain typically invites us to shut down and to avoid, rather than to be patient. And to know that there's another, the Father, who's guarding and guiding in that. I don't know if that answers your question. It begins to. Okay.
Saw some hands back over this direction. In the very back or not?
Shall I? Yeah, I got it. I would like to distinguish, again, perhaps not separate, but distinguish clearly between finitude and sinfulness. I think to be finite is not identical with being sinful. This is another way of saying that the finite world in itself has goodness, which I think the Catholic tradition is really good about stressing. So I think there's a lot in theology, there's a lot of confusion just on that point, between kind of saying finite in the same breath as sinful. And I think that's wrong. So let's distinguish those two. That's just perhaps one contribution. It's not an answer, but it's a contribution to kind of like let's try and see also what is good about being finite. About, you know, like we would be, I think, actually quite miserable if we lived forever. So you know, like there's goodness in finitude. Finitude is not all sinful. And then but the participation, with participation in God's work. I would think of the kingdom of God there and the way Jesus talks about it is here and it has arrived and we can participate in it, even though it is only like the seed or like the yeast or like, you know, the small thing, but it grows and grows. And we have a part of that, but not in the revelation kind of quite full way yet. I don't know whether you want to.